more or less ethical things to do. But one of the concepts that has always been a recurring theme for me, at least throughout my career, is whether or not anyone and everyone is a buyer.
Hmm.
And you've got these two people on either end of the spectrum with Grant Cardone and Jordan Belfort. They did that infamous interview many years back, really covering this topic. But curious to hear your thoughts on this. Is everyone indeed a buyer?
Most people are not a buyer. And I think as soon as salespeople understand that, one, it'll do better to the trade and the label of salespeople, because salespeople that are walking around believing that everybody is a buyer, that's the reason why you get bad sales, overselling, deceit, and all those terrible things in sales. But if you walk in believing that most people aren't, you actually become more of a doctor, and you are diagnosing and creating a diagnosis to be able to prescribe a medicine, which is your product. Right. So if I feel like if more salespeople walked around seeing themselves as potential doctors, and well, not everybody is a patient, right? The same way not everybody is a buyer. So the always be selling ABC, Glenn Glary, Glenn Ross stuff, Wolf of Wall Street stuff, it's really good for the movies. It's amazing for the movies. I love watching it too. I laugh. But most of the time when you see those things, they're really horrible and heinous tactics. For Wall Street, they ended up in jail. Boiler Room, that was a scandal. Glengarry Glen Ross, that didn't really work out very well. So when you really look at some of these influences where people kind of typecast salespeople, you really look at the whole story, not the fun stuff. Well, those people didn't really last very long. So no, most people are not buyers, and you'll get a lot better sales if you realize that.
Yeah, I got to agree with that. Obviously, met salespeople that have a very different philosophy, but it was, at least in that role, very much top down. There was no discerning if they're a buyer or not. Everyone's a buyer, and I think that was a pretty negative thing for that company and the industry as a whole.
Absolutely. I think that if everybody is a buyer, that just even the premise, right? It already should raise some red flags, because it's pretty much saying do something to make them a buyer. That's really what that is saying, and that's terrifying. Do whatever you can to get them in, even if it means slashing your prices and things like that. And even that has its own issues, right? If you're saying, fine, I'm going to give you a free 6 months, you're doing that because you're still going to charge them eventually. So why not just be completely honest and not give a mystification of free? You can give benefits and incentives and things like that. But it just leads to so many different avenues in terms of how it's sold, what is sold. Are you really positioning a value prop? Are you really pricing it fairly? Are you really telling the truth on its value? Are you actually standing for something? So many salespeople actually don't stand for things because they believe everybody's a buyer. Thus, a lot of products get disrespected, and they don't make it. They don't really go the distance. They don't make it the long haul as salespeople or as products.
There's a basic principle in economics, which is that demand creates supply, not the other way around. And I don't think I ever really understood what that meant until I would be in sales and I have something for you and people don't want it. And to your point, I could slash the price and maybe that gets them across the finish line, but that doesn't really create a bona fide buyer. Might get you a sale, but it's not what creates the buyer. And so the reality is that, the demand creates the supply, and that's what sets the price. And if we flip it and start looking at some of the ethical or unethical ways of selling, I want to start with the one call close because I know there's a lot of companies that still utilize it, and I did it for many years with various products that I've sold. Do either of you think that there's still a place in this world for the one call close with salespeople, or is that outdated?
I have a video on YouTube that literally is titled "The One Call Close Doesn't Exist." So that's why I was like laughing just now. I'm like, the one call close. I think that it can exist, but is it a sell? Yeah, you can get someone to purchase an item through a one call close, right? But do you really have a customer? Do you really have a client, for instance? Yeah, I've sold deals from one call, but I can probably really think on the top of my head how those all went down the road, maybe 2, 3 months later, or maybe even a few hours later. We all know what buyer's remorse is, but then we all, at the same time, talk about one call closes in narratives. That in itself combats, right? It's like we have to also be able as salespeople to be able to get in front of potential buyer's remorse by really giving time to be able to get the real pain points out there, the real value prop out there, really attaching it, and actually getting somebody to take action and be motivated to stay with. So that would be my position on it. I don't know what you think, Mark.
Yeah, I think I have two thoughts on it, because one, we're now in a time where I think the idea of close, it's all about getting that new, I'm losing I had a light here and it seems to not want to be going anymore. Okay. The idea of just close doesn't matter. We're just looking at that net new. We're actually, I think, past that point, at least in the B2B space that I exist in. The idea of getting a customer that has a high lifetime value as being the metric to look at is much more well known. If you're a sales rep that's closing and then those people are either not renewing or maintaining a very low contract or whatever, I think that's no longer good enough in a lot of ways. So on the one hand, I think that's going to help with some of the negative behavior. On the other hand, we have buyers, B2B buyers, that are much more self-led, meaning many of them have done all of this work, research, before they end up talking to a sales rep. And some of them might just be like, yeah, I'm ready. Let's go. I've already looked at everything else. Like I'm fully educated. Again, I'm not on the front lines of sales anymore, so I don't know, but I'm just observing that a lot of the times a buyer comes in and they have been doing their research for months and they know what they want. So I'm of those two minds right now, but I don't know if there's such thing as a one call close in practice.
I think to the points that William had mentioned a few moments ago here, where renewals had been mentioned up, and Mark, you've talked about as well, will that be a happy customer and a long-term customer? And on this show, we've talked a few times about data modeling and what we would call the bow tie data model created by Winning by Design. But if we think about the one call close, that might get new sales in what I would call the left side of the bow tie. So it gets a deal in the door, it closes some revenue. But if that person is not renewing, if they're not purchasing more and you're not getting upsales or cross sales, then again, the right side of the bow tie, what happens after the initial transaction, that's what's being missed. And revenue operations, I would define it as the science of sustainable revenue growth, right? So if you don't have sustainable revenue growth, then you don't have good revenue operations. So just taking it back, in my opinion, is the one call close a way to get net new revenue? It can be. It probably is, to what Will said earlier, trying to make everyone a buyer when maybe they shouldn't all be. But it's not, in my opinion, a great way of getting long-term sustainable revenue for growth and scale, which is really what every business wants.
No, absolutely. And I think that even as Mark was mentioning, the people who come in, they're the self-starters. They're the people who, okay, I know everything. I've done a lot of research and all that. Even then, I still don't allow it to be a one call close, even if they're coming in ordering up the menu. Because I have seen people that will love you fast and hate you just faster, right? This is amazing. It's everything I want. I've done all this research. I know everything about it and all that stuff. And then 2 weeks later, their expectations were way over here, where honestly, the realities of life or the realities of sales or the realities of the market are actually over here. They probably didn't consider that. So a lot of people who come in and kick in the door and say, I know everything, I see that also as a potential one call close issue. And how often do salespeople say, okay, I get that you like this, but why? What happens if nothing happens? I love that question for people who are extremely willing to move forward. What happens in 3 weeks if you got zero revenue? What if no deals happened in the next 2 months? What do you think went wrong? Is it the sales? Is it the product? Is it the market? How do you process nothing in 3 weeks or in 6 weeks? And they usually get very surprised by those questions, because I'm trying to give them like an Armageddon example just to see where their expectations are, right? And it's fascinating because that question usually exposes where their mind is. No, but we should absolutely be able to have at least $10 million of revenue in 3 weeks. No, That now I know why you're so excited. Now I know your motivations for moving forward, or now I know why you want to move right to the next step after the first call, because maybe your expectations are not really aligned with the realities of whether how sales works or how revenue is generated in your business. These things usually need to be qualified a bit more before taking somebody on as a client so that they can stay, because that's really what people should be looking at.
Thank you for tuning into the SprocketPod podcast. We hope you enjoyed today's episode with your co-hosts, Cameron Collins and Mark Lerner. Be sure to catch us live every week on LinkedIn, and don't forget to subscribe to our episodes on YouTube and Spotify. If you found this episode valuable, please leave a review and share it with others looking to get more from HubSpot. Until next time, keep driving success with your CRM, and as always, Sprocket on.